Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Ukraine is fighting a war against an invader, Russia, but also at the same time against a problem considered to be endemic within its own borders. Corruption has long been an enemy within for Ukraine. One of the principal criticisms of the country when it comes to candidate status for example, the European Union. The dismissal or resignation of Defence Minister Alexei Reznikov is a clear sign that President Vladimir Zelensky is determined to crack down on corruption. This time, it was military uniforms. There have been cases in the past, going back as far as living memory goes. Now, in a time of war, Ukraine is grasping that corruption nettle firmly in an attempt to rip it up by the roots to ensure a corruption-free future for the rebuilding of the country. So how large a task lies ahead? How important a job is this? Let's bring you our panel who are going to discuss the issues relating to this in the next hour. Here in the studio, here at France 24, Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French UN military mission, sir. Pleasure to see you, as always. On the other side of the studio, Richard Verdi, France and European Affairs correspondent for Blick. Richard, great to see you too.
Good evening, Mark.
In Kyiv, Tatiana Ogakova, head of international development at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Tatiana, thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
And in Vilnius, Lithuania, Alexandra Filipenko, a political analyst who we call upon often for her points of view. Alexandra, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed. Now, before we let the panel loose, let's get some context on the present situation. Reznikov's departure is just one of many cases that have affected Ukraine's fighting forces over the past year. There have been many questions over prices paid for provisions and hardware since the Russians invaded in February 2022. This report by Shirley Sipon.
Alexei Reznikov has been Ukraine's defense minister since before the war broke out. The military jacket scandal was the ultimate corruption case his ministry has had to face. Like in previous scandals, products, this time jackets, were ordered for an initial price, but in the end, Ukraine paid several times more. On top of this, it appears the jackets are completely useless. The order was for winter jackets, but the ones delivered from Turkey were summer ones. The minister denied the allegations.
As one investigative journalist said in one of his posts, the ministry bought summer jackets 3 times cheaper, and then, through a Harry Potter magic wand operation, they turned into winter jackets. This is not true.
This is just the latest in several scandals, which isn't new for Ukraine. The country ranks 116th out of 180 on the International Corruption Perceptions Index. Before the jackets, Ukrainian authorities say there was food, also purchased for soldiers at a price that is several times the market price. There's also widespread corruption linked to military recruitments. The people shown here are not involved. Thousands of young Ukrainians have tried to either avoid or flee the battlefield. Ukrainian investigators say various officials have accepted bribes to help them escape or get medical exemptions.
There are already 112 criminal proceedings against officials of the recruitment centers, 33 suspects.
The most striking case may be the one involving a recruitment official in Odessa who used some of the money he reportedly embezzled to buy this villa in Spain.
The context there from Shirley Sipon. Let's bring in our guests to talk about this situation and start in Kyiv with Tatiana Ogakova, head of international development at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Tatiana, this latest case of corruption, the military uniforms. I mean, who's cashing in on that? Who's making the money out of it? Who's behind it all?
Well, the question is difficult because at that moment we don't know exactly. So this under investigation now. So we will know that a little bit later. But the evidence is that given that there were a lot of scandals during the past months, this dismissal of Alexei Reznikov was inevitable because there is a kind of intolerance of the society, of the civil society and entire Ukrainian society towards corruption, because we lived through an extremely difficult moment in the full-scale aggression of Russian Federation against Ukraine. A lot of suffering in the country, a lot of sacrifice coming from ordinary citizens. I mean, from ordinary people who lose their lives, who lose members of their families. And each case, even if it's not proven, it was a wise political decision of Zelensky to replace Reznikov, even if it will be proven that he is not personally guilty in this case, but it was a right decision to make in this context.
Indeed, Tatiana, no charges actually against Reznikov. That's the situation.
Yes, exactly. So all of these will be investigated. We know that Alexei Reznikov denies any kind of suspicion, and there will be a real investigation and a court afterwards. So give some time, provide some time for justice to be made properly, to be made in terms of how it should be done. But politically, it was high time for Zelensky to replace Reznikov, because all these rumors circulating for months and weeks and months, they were unacceptable for Ukraine, for both Ukrainian society and Ukrainian partners, international partners. In the context, we desperately need Western weapons.
Indeed, an unacceptable situation. Tatiana Ogakova, thank you for now very much indeed for kicking us off. Tatiana there in Kyiv. Let's come back to the studio and bring in Dominic Trenkon, former head of the French UN military mission. Clearly, military uniforms. One can only imagine how it could be a comic situation if it wasn't so tragic, because we're talking about men who are going to face the worst of situations, and people are being killed on the battle lines, and the uniforms are being fudged and messed around in some strange way, and somebody's making money out of it. It seems distasteful, to say the least.
Yes, I mean, the problem is not only the problem of uniforms. You've seen the different problem which was shown like that. Because as uniform, I'm working in a company who's providing uniform. You don't have winter and summer uniform. You have different layers. And that is what is protected for the winter and the cold. But in any case, this corruption problem is a major problem for President Zelensky. He was elected to fight against corruption, so he has to show that he is doing something. And as we say in the French system, in the French army, the boss is always responsible. So if something is happening in the department, you take the hammer and you crush the minister. So that's exactly what's happening inside the system, to show that the ministry should manage properly the system, but also it's very important for the citizen in Ukraine, but mainly for European and American. Of course, European citizen can't accept that they are providing money and that the money is going in the pockets of someone else and not providing what the soldier needed.
And we're talking massive amounts of money from the EU, something like 7 billion, I think. I'm sure Richard will correct me on that one. From the US, over 40 billion just for military aid, something like nearly 80 billion if you talk about overall aid. It's a massive amount of money. I'm wondering the effect on the fighting man, the fighting woman, the members of the army who are going to face, death in many cases. This must be a terrible effect on them to sort of feel this corruption is going on around them.
Yes, and the announcement arrived at a time when the president is on the front.
Straight to
He was in
Bakhmut,
Zaporizhia, is now in Bakhmut. So he's just in contact with the soldier, showing that he's taking care of the soldier, listening to what they've said, and showing also that he's managing the problem in Kiev for the soldier on the ground. And I think this is very important at this time where the offensive is in a difficult position. We're talking about that. We don't know exactly where we are. So it is a difficult situation.
Can I bring in Alexandra Filipenko, excuse me, Alexandra, in Vilnius, Lithuania. Alexandra, do you think Zelensky's acted at the right time? Should he perhaps have acted sooner?
As Tatiana said, it was definitely high time for Reznikov to be removed, because this topic of corruption escalated in the past months, I would say. Maybe he could have done it before, but it was necessary to show that there are no untouchables. And Reznikov, who is apart from some scandals, is I should say maybe even loved by Ukrainians, because he was extremely successful at his job. The International Military Coalition in Ramstein, the supplies of arms and military equipment to Ukraine, to the large extent, it's his win, actually. And but still, all those scandals, it was high time to show that there are no untouchables, and Reznikov was a convenient figure for this purpose. And I think that the emphasis is that former relations no longer exist, and it's a signal to Western partners, of course. Back in 2021, Vladimir Zelensky said that there would be no oligarchs in the country. The parliament adopted the so-called law on oligarchization of Ukraine. I'm sorry for pronouncing it this way. So it was back in 2021. And of course, in wartime, it is very, very important for such scandals not to appear. And even a few weeks ago, Vladimir Zelensky was talking in his usual evening address and saying that corruption would be equated to a war crime during wartime. So it was high time for such corruption scandals with Alexei Reznikov to be over. And now, of course, the law enforcement will either speak or nothing will come out of it. But in any case, I think, as you've said, it's also good for the morale of the soldiers and for the spirit of the soldiers to know that someone who is taking care of them, first of all, and not his own finances, is the head of the military, the Minister of Defense. And in all likelihood, his place will be taken by Rustam Umerov. That's what Ukrainian analysts are saying, a Crimean Tatar, a Muslim with good international connections, especially in Muslim countries. He's very experienced. And again, we should remember that there were rumors that this probably new Minister of Defense was poisoned in March 28, 2022, during the talks with the Russian side. And most probably, he personally said that it was fake, but there was this rumor at least. So it is good that the Minister of Defense will be a new person, an experienced, of course, person who is responsible for the return of the Azov soldiers from Russian captivity. And again, it is very important for Ukrainian soldiers' morale, of course, and spirits.
Alexandra, thank you. You've opened up many layers on this debate, but that idea about the role of the oligarchs is important. That's a large word which I can't say, so don't worry about you falling over it. It's not a problem at all. We get the picture. Oligarchization, I think. I managed to say it correctly. That's an issue, isn't it, obviously, in terms of corruption, the role that maybe oligarchs play. But, Richard, is there an issue about sort of just basically everyday person on the street kind of corruption too? It's a kind of way of life.
Well, corruption is clearly an issue in Ukraine. When you go to Kiev, I was in Kiev in May, June, and people were talking about corruption. But one thing that struck me is when I was close to the front line, talking with army units, the soldiers did not talk much about corruption at that time. And I understand that since June and during this summer, the questions about corruption and those scandals have gone up, probably because of the media revelations and so on. Now, what's my interrogation is the political gamble behind it for Zelensky. I mean, I'm talking about under the control of the General Trinquant, but whenever you have a war, it's important that the political team at the helm of the country is united. And a head of state cannot manage a country at war alone. He needs a minister he trusts, he needs a team of advisors he trusts, and also because those ministers, those team of advisors, they link with a Western country, with the backers of Ukraine. Now there is a question mark. I understand that the potential new minister of defense is well connected to the Middle East country, but Reznikov hadn't managed to establish strong link with the USA, with Europe, and so on. on. So what will be the political cost for Zelensky of firing Reznikov for apparently good reason? And will there be a price to pay, especially at a time when we have a counter-offensive going on? Decision must be taken. Those crucial next 6 weeks will be very important. So there I am a little bit more cautious. On the one hand, I think there is matter to be satisfied because of the fight on corruption, but there is also maybe matter to be worried about the strength of the government and the strength of the connection between Zelensky and his new Minister of Defense and the credibility of this new Minister of Defense towards its general, which is a matter I don't know, but it's also very important to know whether the generals will respect this new Minister of Defense as they were respecting Reznikov.
Okay, before we ask General Trancon, let's go back to Kyiv to get the insight of Tatiana Olgakova. Tatiana, I hope you heard what Richard was saying about this gamble by Zelensky. Is there a possible breakdown, I think, that could happen? Do you feel there's something that Zelensky's done here that may, at some point, backfire?
Well, we still are optimistic about what will follow. We have a rather good opinion on Mr. Umerov, who will take place very probably tomorrow, starting from tomorrow, of this position of Minister of Defense. His reputation is excellent, and not publicly, but there are rumors that he has already participated in some negotiations about weapons with some Western countries. We were not informed about which particular countries and what kind of weapons. Politically, I think that Zelensky is winning this battle because he would appear as somebody who tries his best to keep the country united. This is indeed very important to raise any kind of doubts about what they are really doing. And they have good chances to consolidate both society and Western partners by this decision. To the credit of Umerov, I would also say that his national identity, I mean his Crimean Tatar, is also very important. We're in the stage of the counter-offensive when Crimea is coming closer, even if you understand it will not happen tomorrow, but it will happen one day. So somebody who cared a lot during his career about Crimea, I would remind simply that he was one of the co-founders of this Crimean platform, this diplomatic initiative for the Crimea before the full-scale invasion of Russian Federation here. So somebody who cares a lot. So it's a clear signal to Western community at the same time how the war should end. So it should end with the liberation of Crimea. And this is a powerful message of Zelensky, and I think it should not be taken for granted.
Indeed, Tatiana, indeed. It's a clear message being given by appointing a Crimean Tatar as defense minister, that it's saying something about Crimea belongs to Ukraine. I think that's a really clear image. Tatiana, thank you. General Trancon, you were waiting to talk.
Yeah, just on the impact on the current offensive, I think there will be no impact. In fact, the line of command is between the president and the general. The Minister of Defense is not at all involved in the offensive. He's involved in the organization of the Minister of Defense and of the equipment for the future. But currently, the line of command, it's a bit like in France. I mean, we've got the President of the Republic and the Chief of Defense Staff. And the minister is just it's very important, but he's organizing, but he's not involved in the counter-operation.
So in terms of the unified sort of thought that it sends, though, surely it must be better to have a minister hand in hand, so to speak, with the president rather than someone who's in this situation.
Of course.
Clearly that sends a clearer image of unity.
Of course, they need to be hand in hand because they are talking about the same thing. But on the current operation, I mean, the minister is not involved in the current operation. It's just the president and the chief of defense staff.
So you see no impact on the counteroffensive of the change of minister. And importantly, you see no impact on this uniform scandal. It's actually almost a bit of a red herring because, as you pointed out, with your knowledge and your insight, some uniform is in fact just basically a winter uniform that's you take 50% of it off.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
it's not as alarming as people might think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the problem was the price of the uniform.
Yeah.
The fact that the price was different from what was written initially. And but this happened. No, I shouldn't say very often, but we have an example in Mali, for example, where they were buying uniform and the socks was sold $120 one socks, and that was the price. And the money, of course, was going into their pocket. At that time, it was the Ministry of Defense, but apparently in this case, it is not the case, but is going in the pocket of someone, certainly.
Indeed, and this is the shocking thing. Sorry, Richard, go ahead.
No, I'll go back to the profile of the new Minister of Defense, or the person that we expect to become the new Minister of Defense. I understand that the fact that he's from Crimea, that he's a Tatar, is important symbolically and politically. But that can bring also certain strains with Western allies of Ukraine. I'm not sure all Western allies are ready for Ukraine to retake Crimea as it is at the moment. There is a debate about Crimea. There is a debate about the final goal of this offensive. So I understand that President Zelensky is putting the Crimean symbol on top of the current offensive. But has he consulted Western allies? Do they know this person? Have they given the green light? For me, those are important questions.
Okay.
Yeah, just my point is that Ukraine, of course, don't have to ask a green line to appoint a minister. First point. Second point, Crimea, it's a discussion between European countries, but it is clearly the objective given by the president of Ukraine. And you have seen that in the European meeting, they were saying we will support Ukraine until the victory. And the victory for Ukraine is Crimea. We can discuss afterwards if it's possible or not. But I think that currently President Zelensky clearly showed that his aim is there, and my Minister of Defense is coming from Crimea and from the Tatar. He's not a Russian or Ukrainian. He's a Tatar, and that's very important to show that they have suffered from Russia for many years.
Indeed. Alexandra Filipenko, can I bring you back in to talk on that issue? Because you were mentioning that who you thought the new defense minister would be. That brings up the issue. He's a Tatar from Crimea. That issue, do you think it's something that Zelensky maybe should have consulted other countries about? It's something that's just his business, Ukraine's business. Do you think it will make any difference in how the EU, the US looks upon supporting Ukraine?
I think, first of all, yes, of course, it's only President Zelensky and only the office of the president should decide upon that. But I think it's highly symbolic that a Crimean Tatar with good international connections in Muslim countries, experienced in international negotiations, responsible for the freedom of leaders of Azov, who organized the summit in Saudi Arabia and advocates for the deoccupation of Crimea, is going to be the head of the Ministry of Defense. And I think that for Ukraine, this is the main symbol. I'm sure that now the office of the president would never support my words, but I think that Crimea is even more symbolic for Ukraine than other eastern territories that were occupied by Russia from 2014. And I don't think that Kiev, of course, will be ready to negotiate and be ready to leave those territories and give them to Russia, but Crimea is definitely a symbol for Kiev. The Crimean bridge that was first hit by the drones, and now drones are absolutely changing the warfare. But what was the main goal, the first goal of drones? It was not Moscow airports, as now it is happening now. First, it was the Crimean bridge, the bridge that connects Russia with the Crimean Peninsula. So I think think that, of course, Umerov, who will most probably become the minister, is an absolutely symbolic figure. And again, coming back to that story of probably poisoning, maybe poisoning, or at least rumors about his poisoning during the talks with Russia, I think this is also highly symbolic that President Zelensky would put such a person as the minister. So I would say that this shows what is the end game, what is going to be the end game. And again, I am sure that Kiev and the office of the president would not sign under my words, but I think this maybe shows Western partners what is more symbolic, not the eastern regions, but Crimea. And if Crimea is back with Ukraine, then maybe something like a negotiation might have a chance to happen. That is my feeling.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. So corruption could in some way subvert confidence. And if you think about the reconstruction of Ukraine, that could cost $138 billion, according to Mustafa Naim, head of the Agency for Restoration and Development of Ukraine. He told me that back in February. Now, let me show you an extract from our conversation that we had on the Maidan Square in Kyiv.
We are not talking now about restoration, we are talking about survival stage of the restoration. And we should do everything now to restore our critical infrastructure, roads and bridges, not to stop all our cargoes for the front line for people. And from the other side, you know that we was affected our energy sector, energy grid, huge, tremendously, last 4 months. So for this year, we'll focus on the critical infrastructure, roads and bridges, and electricity grid, and building up shelters for our electricity, and of course the residential areas, because many people lost their houses. But I think in the future we should have big strategy and plan to rebuild country, rebuild it better than what we had before, because we don't want to rebuild again Soviet Union. We need expertise for that, we need money for that, and of course we need people who can come and help us with this. From the other side, I see how many people now want to help us. You can't even imagine how many people doing themselves what they can do on the local level and the central level. So for us, this moment is just a moment to focus all our efforts to survive and to fight and to win.
So Mustafa Naim there, the head of the Agency for Restoration and Development in Ukraine, $138 billion was what he said it would cost. By June, the World Bank put that figure much higher, $411 billion. At a donors meeting in London, the EU pledged a further $50 billion in loans and grants, with the UK and the US following suit, with a promise of $3 billion and $1.3 billion, respectively, in financial support. This on top of the massive sums in military aid that's been given already, for instance, over $40 billion from the US so far. It comes to the question, and I'll come back to our guest in Kyiv, Tatiana Olgakova. How can we be sure that all this money will be spent in the right way? It's an issue that I was discussing with Mustafa back in February. How can we be sure that this cash will go in the right places, via the right people, and not somehow be spirited into, well, someone else's bank account?
That's a very good question, given all the context, but I think we should think it in a strategic way, and to plan all this reconstruction process according to European rules. And I think that even if we're talking a lot about so-called endemic corruption in Ukraine, it doesn't mean that every agent in Ukraine is corrupted. I think the majority of people and the majority of companies and the majority of people are willing to reconstruct, they're willing to receive this aid. And this fight anti-corruption is also needed for two existential questions Ukraine faces. And precisely membership in the European Union and NATO, because if there would be no guarantees from NATO, there's no point to go on in reconstruction, because this existential threat coming from Russian Federation will be here in 10 years, in 20 years, and in 30 years. So we really need security guarantees after the war, as we hope after the Ukrainian victory. And in order to get there, we need to fight corruption. And I have no doubt that the majority of Ukrainian society understands that. So, and there is a kind of unity regarding this question. No doubt there are people who are making profit out of the war. My guess is that you would find such type of people in any society, because it's very easy during the war. But we need a systematic effort coming both from Ukrainian society, Ukrainian civil society, and international partners in order to maintain this pressure over the Ukrainian government to fight against corruption, in order to get it eradicated, to get it over, in order to achieve these three objectives: European Union, NATO, and reconstruction.
Alexandra in Vilnius, do you get a sense that this is happening? Alexandra Filipenko is joining us from Vilnius, political analyst. Do you get a sense, Alexandra, that this is happening, that the Ukrainian government is moving in the right direction, Zelensky is doing the right things to try to eradicate, get rid of corruption?
Zelensky and Kiev recently announced a crusade, basically a crusade against corruption. And I think that this is one of the symbols of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet Empire, and the way Ukraine tries to shag off this past, this Soviet past, because for anyone in the post-Soviet country, everyone understands how corruption works and how deep corruption is in any post-Soviet society. In Russia and in Belarus, it is still extremely widespread. And for Kiev, I think this would be symbolic to shag off this past, the Soviet past. And the recent arrest of Igor Kolomoisky, one of the richest men in Ukraine, it became top news. And those twists of the life of this controversial businessman who once, some time ago, people were talking that Zelensky was part of Kolomoisky's group, let's say. So those twists in the life of Kolomoisky immediately caused a wave of rumors and speculations whether this is really the end of the, let's say, oligarchs era, or it's just an impressive PR campaign of the authorities. And Kolomoisky was suspected of committing fraud and money laundering. And according to the investigation, he legalized about $14 million and transferred the money abroad. So putting Kolomoisky under arrest and giving that sign that there is no one above the law, and I think this is a good step, of course, by Kiev. Again, a good step to show European partners, first of all. And on the day of Kolomoisky's arrest, actually, in his traditional evening address, Zelensky said that for those who robbed Ukraine and put themselves above the law, the life would never be as before. So this is a crusade against corruption, maybe even a kind of a show-off crusade, and a very big crusade against corruption that Kiev is trying to stress, and it's showing and signaling to the European and American partners that things will not be as before, that life would not be as before for any oligarchs or anyone, as Zelensky put themselves above the law. So I think this is moved to at least to the right direction.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. Do bear with us. I've got one observation, having filmed briefly in Moscow, having filmed briefly in Kyiv. Once upon a time in Moscow many years ago, every time we got the camera out, someone would pop up and say, give me $50 or I'll arrest you, or you couldn't film. In Kyiv, it was like, how can we help you? Can we get you a cup of tea? Are you okay? So different times, different places, different people. But, you know, I think picking up on Tetiana's point, not everybody is corrupt. That's probably the thing to remember. General.
Yeah, but certainly it's very right. I mean, corruption is a legacy of the Soviet Union. Yeah. And the big difference is that the Russian will not change. But Ukraine have no choice. If they want to join Europe, they've got to change the rules. They've got to change the way they are behaving. And so at the same time, they've got no choice, but at the same time, it is their choice not to be like the former Soviet Union. For the Russian, nothing will change. So corruption will still be there. So when we're talking, when you are talking about the money given by Ukraine and all that, everybody say, yeah, it is corrupted, it is corrupted. I say, just wait a minute, look at Russia. It's worse than in Ukraine, and Ukraine has to improve if they want to join Europe, and that's their choice.
Of course, as you just pointed out, once you accept the situation and you talk about the situation, things do start to change. Especially when you think about the amount of money that could come in a kind of like a modern day or latter day Marshall Plan type restructuring to try and help and recreate Ukraine. We're talking a massive amount of money that could be spent in the future.
Well, first of all, some words about the amount. You mentioned 138 billion. You say World Bank is talking about 450 billion. If we talk about the reconstruction of the country, it is clearly above $1 trillion, and it's probably going to cost more, because at the moment what you identify is road to repairs, rail tracks, and so on. But there are many, many other things that you'll have to reconstruct after the war. So at the moment, it's really difficult to quantify the amount of money for reconstruction. Now, sorry, I'll be less optimistic about corruption. I understand clearly there is a lot of effort being done and being implemented by the government of President Zelensky. And as the general put it, he has no choice. I mean, it's a bit unfair to say he has no choice. I would say that personally, he probably believes in what he's doing, not only to please the Western allies, but he is a person who has clearly understood that if Ukraine wants to be a modern, Western-oriented country, he should really take out corruption. Now, massive corruption will come again when massive money comes in. At the moment, the money that comes in is attached to military equipment. So sorry to say, but in a time of war, it's quite easy to control for those who give money or for those who give material. When it comes to civilian reconstruction, you'll have to rebuild school, you'll have to rebuild a lot of buildings, bridges, we talked about it, and so on. Then be careful. It's not because corruption is rooted out today that it will not come back tomorrow in time of reconstruction. I mean, working against corruption is a long-term thing, so it's important to congratulate President Zelensky for his effort, but he'll have to watch out, and the international community will have to watch out. And sorry to say, in many other countries, international community is not always good at monitoring corruption. And by the way, a number of financial interests in the West have also benefited from corruption in the past. So corruption is not only one way. It's not only Ukrainians who get the money. I mean, whenever there is corruption somewhere, those who provide the money are also benefiting from it. So it has to be the West which is also implementing strict anti-corruption rule when reconstruction time will come in Ukraine.
So it is that sense that all along the process...
Exactly. And I'm talking as a Swiss. I'm talking as a Swiss, and you know the role Switzerland banks are playing very often. And it's a kind of symbol that the first reconstruction conference for Ukraine after the beginning of the war was held in Lugano, Switzerland in 2022. But anti-corruption, rooting out corruption is a process from the one who give to the one who receive. It's not only at the receiving end. It would be too easy to blame the Ukrainians.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Let's go back to Kyiv, to Tatiana Orgakova of the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Tatiana, I hope you're able to follow what Richard was saying. I found it fascinating. I suspect you did too. I'm wondering what the situation is regarding reconstruction where you are. Are you seeing things happening? Is there a sense that Ukraine is trying to rebuild in spite of still being at war?
Well, I visit a lot all Western regions and also regions in the south, the occupied territories. And what I can say that some villages and some cities, some towns are already on their way of reconstruction. The budget comes from every corner in Ukraine. It could be local budget, it could be state budget. But if you, for example, travel to Kharkiv and its district Saltivka, which was severely damaged back in March 2022, now you see all of these being under reconstruction. This is incredible. This is, you see how all these houses are coming back to life, literally. So, but globally, I would not say that you can see that everywhere. In many places, there is still no signs of life. There are entire villages which are completely destroyed. There are no electricity, no gas, no water, and no people at all. So vast wastelands of territories which are completely destroyed and which will need a lot of investment and a lot of human resources, because let us talk about demining. Reconstruction will start after demining, and a lot of Ukrainian territories are extremely mined. I'm talking about territories which we can control now, but if we just think about territories which are now and this Ukraine counter-offensive in Zaporizhia region, they're extremely mined. So all of this will take years to demine, to reconstruct, to bring life back to these territories. It will be a very long way. It will cost a lot for everybody, to Ukraine and to our partners, to our friends. But we have no other option but to try to bring back life to these territories.
Tatiana, for now, thank you very much indeed. General Tranquil, I'm wondering, as Tatiana's talked about demining and that whole process, in your view, how long does that take? How much will that cost? How difficult is it to do?
Very long time. If we've got a very important example is Cambodia. They are still demining. So it will take a very long time. We are perhaps in a better position in the fact that there are many anti-tank mines, which are big mines, in fact. As in Cambodia, a lot of small booby traps and different small mines. So I think, but anyway, in the front line of the Russian forces currently, you've got thousands of mines. When I was in Yugoslavia, in a small piece of land, we had 47,000 mines, and it takes 3-4 years to demine all that. Wow. Because demining is made by hand. You have to...
By hand?
Yes, of course. You have to look at the mine and take the mines out. So it takes a very, very long time. And you can't have agriculture, anything, when you've got mine.
And of course, Ukraine being a country that depends on agriculture.
Exactly. A lot of the ground will be frozen for years. Yeah.
I saw that you have now some kind of demining vehicles that you can put forward on the mining field. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, but that's what you use in operation to break through a defense system. So you do that to go very quickly. But doesn't mean that you don't have several mines who are still there. Okay. So to demine, you must be very careful and do that by hand.
Alexandra Filipenko, I hope you've been able to follow what we've been discussing, the idea of the reconstruction, the problems that lie ahead. Clearly there are large political angles in terms of attracting that money in to support and rebuild. And clearly it is a massive task that the President and his administration has to keep that coming in and secure that.
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why this anti-corruption crusade started. This is why Kyiv needs the Western partners to understand that the Ukrainian officials are doing all they can to fight the corruption. Because what we've been seeing in the United States and also in European countries, that the taxpayers, first of all, are asking those questions. How money is being spent, where money is going. This is the questions by taxpayers / voters that are not going to vote for example, if we're talking about the United States, that they won't vote for Democrats if they are not sure that the money will be well spent. And we've seen that Republicans are using the sentiment of Ukraine not being a democracy, but being an oligarch state, that money is not being spent the right way. And of course, for Kyiv, for Ukrainians, it's very important to show that the money is being spent the right way. And especially now when Ukraine needs long-range weapons, that's what Zelensky and Kyiv is asking the partners to provide. And of course, Ukraine is developing those long-range weapons that hit targets 700 kilometers away. And we've heard Zelensky saying that those weapons are being produced already by Ukraine's Ministry of Strategic Industries, but still they need more weapons from Western partners. And I think in order to get anything from Western partners right now, Kiev needs to prove that the money is being spent the best way possible. And of course, it goes for the reconstruction, it goes for new weapons, it goes for everything that Ukraine needs right now. And especially talking about the what you've been discussing right now, that in order to free the lands, not only from Russian soldiers, but also from the weapons that are laying there, it is not only takes time, it takes a lot of money, of course. And now Ukraine apparently needs more funds and more help from Western partners, and Zelensky and the office of the president definitely needs those signals to Western partners, and that's what they're trying to do the best way possible.
Very much indeed. Alexandra Filipenko, political analyst in Vilnius. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Tetiana Ogakova, Head of International Development at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center in Kyiv. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to my two guests in the studio, Richard Verdi of Blick and General Dominique Trinquant, former head of the French UN military mission. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Thanks to you all, and thanks to you for watching too. Do stay with us here on France 24.